The bass was so loud it lived in Imani's chest, and she hated every second of it as she shoved through the crowd at Velour Lounge looking for the friend who never knew when to stop. Somebody at the door had texted her, "Come get Brielle, she's wrecked." And now here she was at midnight, on a Tuesday in heels she'd thrown on without socks, sweeping the VIP hallway with her eyes until she found the half-open door marked with a brass 9. She saw the back of a tall man first. Dark jacket, broad shoulders, one arm wrapped around a woman whose head lolled against him like her neck had given up. The woman's braids, the gold hoop earrings Imani had bought her last Christmas. Brielle. She didn't think. That was the thing she'd tell herself later, over and over. She didn't think. She just moved. She crossed the room in 3 steps, pulled Brielle out from under his arm, and slapped him across the face hard enough that her own palm stung. "Get your hands off her," she said. "What is wrong with you? She can't even stand up." The man's head had snapped to the side. He brought it back slowly, one hand rising to his jaw, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, not exactly. Surprise, and underneath it something almost amused, which made her want to slap him again. "You don't get to look at me like that," she said. "I should call the police." He opened his mouth. She didn't wait. She got Brielle's arm over her shoulder and walked her out, past the bouncer who didn't lift a finger, into the cold parking lot where the music finally dropped to a dull thud behind them. Brielle was mumbling, laughing about nothing, completely gone. Imani poured her into the passenger seat of her old Honda and stood there a second with her hand shaking, heart going like she'd run a mile. She didn't sleep much. Brielle threw up twice and Imani held her hair and wiped her face and put her to bed in their tiny apartment off Central Avenue. And by the time the sun came up she'd had maybe 2 hours, which is why she was late. Imani was a head chef. Not a line cook, not a sous. Head chef at Marrow, the restaurant that had put Charlotte on 3 different Best of the South lists in 2 years, and she'd earned every inch of it. 32 years old, calluses on her hands, a temper she kept on a leash 6 days a week. She came up through community college and a culinary program she paid for herself, working doubles, and when the offer came to run Marrow's kitchen, she'd taken it without blinking. That morning there was a staff meeting. The whole restaurant group had been sold. Everybody knew that much, and the new owner was coming in to introduce himself. Imani slid into the back of the dining room with her chef's coat half-buttoned, hoping nobody noticed. The general manager stood up front. "Everyone, I want you to meet the man who just acquired the Marrow Group. He's relocating back to Charlotte after some years out west. This is the new owner." A man stepped out from behind her, tall, dark jacket, and when he turned and his eyes found Imani in the back of the room, his hand drifted up to his jaw, the same cheek, and he smiled. Imani felt the floor tilt. It was him, the man from the lounge, the man she had slapped. She slapped the man who owns the restaurant, she thought, and her whole body went cold. "I'm going to lose everything." Her mother had called the morning before, the way she called every couple of weeks, and the conversation had gone the way it always did. "Imani, baby, your cousin's getting married in June. That's nice, Mama. She's 26. Also nice. You're 32. I'm aware of how old I am." Her mother had sighed that long, theatrical sigh. "I just want to see you settled before I'm gone. You're not going anywhere. And I'm settled. I have a career most people would kill for. A career doesn't hold your hand at the hospital." Imani had pinched the bridge of her nose. She loved her mother. She also knew exactly why she'd decided, somewhere around 25, that marriage wasn't for her. She'd grown up in a house where her parents stayed together out of stubbornness and habit, where her Aunt Dee got left with 3 kids and no warning, where the cousin everybody held up as a success story showed up to Thanksgiving with foundation caked over a bruise nobody was supposed to mention. Imani had watched all of it. She'd decided she'd rather be alone and free than tied to somebody who'd make her smaller. "I'm happy, Mama," she'd said, and meant it mostly. So no. When the new owner of her restaurant turned out to be the man she'd assaulted in a nightclub, romance was the absolute last thing on her mind. Survival was the thing on her mind. For the rest of that day she hid. She sent her sous chef up with the prep reports. She took the back stairs. And then at 4 o'clock the GM found her at her station and said the owner wanted to see her in the office, personally. She walked up there like she was walking to her own execution. He was sitting behind a desk that hadn't had a desk's worth of personality the week before, jacket off now, sleeves rolled. He looked hard, he said. "Have a seat. I'd rather stand, if it's all the same." A corner of his mouth moved. "Suit yourself." He laced his fingers together. "I'm Devin. I figure we got off on an interesting foot. If you're going to fire me, just fire me. I don't need the speech." He raised an eyebrow. "Why would I fire you?" "Because I hit you in the face in front of 40 people. "You hit me," he agreed. "Because you thought a man was taking advantage of a woman who couldn't defend herself. Which, for the record, was not what was happening. Your friend asked me to help her find her phone, then nearly passed out on me, and I was holding her up so she didn't crack her head on the floor. But you didn't know that. You just saw your friend in trouble and you moved. He shrugged. I run a company. I'm not in the business of firing people for having a spine. Imani stood there, with her arguments dying in her throat. That's all, he said, looking back down at his papers. Welcome to the new Marrow. She left feeling more off balance than if he'd thrown her out. The weeks after that should have been simple, and they almost were. Devin turned out to be a good owner, better than the last one, who'd cut corners and stiffed vendors. He paid invoices on time. He fixed the broken walk-in. He came down to the kitchen sometimes and stood out of the way and watched service like he actually understood what he was looking at. And when he had questions, he asked Imani directly, never going over her head. She kept waiting for the catch. She kept waiting for him to bring up the slap, to hold it over her, to turn out to be the kind of man she'd built her whole worldview around avoiding. He never did. He'd ask her to walk him through a new menu and end up arguing with her about whether a dish needed acid, and she'd win, and he'd laugh and concede, and she'd realize an hour had gone by. Brielle, meanwhile, didn't remember any of it. She'd thanked Imani for picking her up, vaguely, the way you thank somebody for something you don't actually recall, and gone right back to her life, which lately meant going out 4 nights a week and coming home broke. Imani covered her share of rent, twice. She told herself that's what you do for family, and Brielle was family. They'd grown up 2 streets apart, come to Charlotte together, split everything down the middle for 6 years. When Marrow's new tasting menu launched and sold out 3 weekends straight, Devin threw a party for the staff. Imani almost didn't go. She went. He sat next to her. There were other seats and he chose the one beside her, and a couple of the surfers traded looks about it, and Imani pretended not to notice and drank too fast because she was nervous, which was a mistake, because she'd never been able to hold her liquor. By 11, she was unsteady on her feet, and Devin was the one who drove her home. She didn't remember much of the ride. She remembered the heater and the quiet and the way he didn't try to talk to her or touch her, just got her to her door and waited until she was inside before he pulled away. She remembered foggily thinking, I could trust this one, and then thinking, that's the dangerous part. It happened slowly and then all at once, the way those things do. A late dinner that wasn't supposed to be a date and was. A drive up to the mountains on her one day off. Him telling her, on a porch in Asheville with his guard all the way down, that he'd loved somebody badly in his 20s and gotten his heart handed back to him in pieces, and that he'd decided a long time ago that he was done with all that. And has her saying me too, and both of them laughing because of course. Of course it was the 2 people who'd sworn off love who couldn't stop circling each other. 6 months later, Devin asked her to marry him in the kitchen at Marrow after close, with the lights low and a ring he'd been carrying around for 3 weeks, and Imani, who had spent her whole adult life certain of one single thing, said yes before she'd even decided to. Brielle was the first person she told. That was her mistake, though she wouldn't understand that for a long time. At first, Brielle was thrilled, squealed, hugged her, demanded to see the ring. But there was something behind her eyes that Imani caught and dismissed, a flatness that came and went. Brielle started asking strange questions. How much was Devin worth, really? Whether Imani had signed anything. Whether she understood how a man like that operated. Imani brushed it off. Brielle had always been a little cynical about money, a little convinced the world was out to cheat her. Then the small things started. A favorite jacket of Imani's, found in the back of her closet with the lining slashed. She blamed a snag, a careless dry cleaner. The savings account she and Brielle shared from their first 2 years in the city, money they'd both agreed to leave untouched for emergencies, drained down to almost nothing, and when Imani asked, Brielle swore up and down she hadn't touched it, said maybe the bank made an error, said it so smoothly that Imani, who wanted to believe her, did, and there were whispers. Devin's younger sister, Asha, who Imani had been getting close to, suddenly went cool on her, stopped returning texts. At a family dinner, she watched Imani across the table with something like suspicion, and when Imani tried to talk to her, Asha said carefully, I just want to make sure my brother's not being used. Used? Imani said. Where is this coming from? Asha didn't answer, but Imani would find out later. Brielle had been getting close to Asha for weeks, coffee, shopping, sympathetic little chats, and feeding her a story drop by drop, that Imani was calculating, that she'd targeted Devin for his money the moment she found out who he was, that the whole sweet enemies to lovers story was a con and Asha's brother was the mark. The worst of it came on a Thursday. Imani got home from a 14-hour day to find half her clothes gone, the apartment rearranged, and Brielle waiting with a face full of fake concern. I think you should find your own place, Brielle said. Honestly, Imani, this engagement's changed you. You've gotten, I don't know, cold. Money does that to people. I don't think I can live with this version of you. Imani stood in the doorway of the apartment she'd paid most of the rent on for 6 years, looking at the woman she'd carried out of a nightclub, and felt something she couldn't name come loose in her chest. You drained the account, she said quietly. Didn't you? I don't know what you're talking about. And the jacket. And whatever you've been telling Asha. You sound paranoid. Brielle's voice was gentle, which was the cruelest part. Maybe you need to talk to someone. Imani packed a bag that night and went to Devon's. She didn't tell him everything at first. She was ashamed, in a way she couldn't fully explain, ashamed that she'd been so wrong about someone, that she'd let it go on so long. But Devon got it out of her piece by piece over the next few days, and his face went hard in a way she'd never seen. He confronted Asha. Imani heard most of it through a door she didn't mean to listen at. Devon asking his sister who had filled her head with all this, Asha admitting in a small voice that it was Brielle, Devon telling her she was old enough to know better than to swallow whatever a jealous woman fed her. Then his voice dropping, gentling, when Asha started to cry. You made a mistake. Now you know the truth. That's what counts. Asha apologized to Imani the next morning with red eyes and meant it. And Imani forgave her because Asha was a kid who'd been scared for her brother and somebody had used that. It wasn't Asha she couldn't forgive. Brielle, she didn't see again before the wedding. Brielle texted twice. Apologies that read like they'd been written by a lawyer. Then when those didn't work, a message so ugly Imani deleted it without finishing. She blocked the number. She told herself that chapter was closed. She should have known better. People like that don't close chapters, they wait. The wedding was 3 weeks out. The dress was done. Imani had splurged on something she'd never have let herself buy a year earlier. Ivory and simple and exactly right. And the last fitting was on a gray September afternoon with rain in the forecast. Devon insisted on driving her himself, even though she told him it was bad luck, even though she laughed at him for being superstitious about the one thing and not the other. He came in anyway. He stood outside the fitting room with his hands in his pockets, and when she stepped out, he went completely still, and for a second he looked at her like he'd forgotten how to talk. Okay, he said finally, hoarse. Okay, we have to get out of here before I change the date to tomorrow. She laughed. She kissed him. It was the kind of moment she used to roll her eyes at in other people's lives. They left the boutique at dusk. The rain had started, hard, the kind that turns headlights into smears. They were maybe 10 minutes from home, talking about nothing, his hand over hers on the console, when an SUV came across the center line on the curve by the reservoir, far too fast, and there was no time at all. Devon yanked the wheel. The last thing Imani felt before the world went sideways was his arm flung across her chest, shoving her back into her seat, and then the sound, and then nothing. She woke up 2 days later with a broken wrist and a row of stitches was above her eyebrow and a fear in her chest so big she couldn't breathe around it. Devon was alive. That was the first thing they told her. Alive, but his head had taken the worst of it. He'd turned the car so the impact came on his side to keep it off of her, and he hadn't woken up. The next 8 weeks were the longest of Imani's life. She went back to work because the bills didn't pause for grief, and every other hour she was at the hospital, sitting beside a man who breathed and didn't open his eyes. His parents came. Asha came and held Imani's good hand and cried with her. The doctors said his vitals were strong, that there was no medical reason he shouldn't wake. They just had to wait. What Imani didn't know, because she couldn't be there every minute, was that someone else had started visiting. Brielle came on the mornings Imani worked. She'd learned the schedule somehow. She'd sit by Devon's bed in a way that made the nurses uneasy, touch his face, talk to him low. One morning she pressed something to his forehead and held his hand and smiled, and not long after, his fingers moved. The hospital called Imani at the restaurant. He's awake. She left a pan on the fire and ran. By the time she got there, his family was crowded outside the door, lit up with joy, and Imani pushed past them into the room and stopped. Devon was sitting up, and in the chair beside him, leaning close, holding his hand like it belonged to her, was Brielle. He looked up at Imani. She waited for his face to break open the way it always did when he saw her. It didn't. He looked at her the way you look at a stranger who's walked into the wrong room. Can I help you? He said. The doctors explained it later in careful words. The trauma had taken a piece of his memory. Not all of it. He knew his parents, his sister, his own name, the company, the years out west. But the last year and a half was simply gone. Imani was gone. The proposal, the porch in Asheville, the kitchen at midnight, the morning he didn't fire her, none of it had ever happened. As far as his brain was concerned, there was no medical reason it should be so precise. It just was. And there, in the gap where she used to live, Brielle moved in. Imani didn't leave. God knows part of her wanted to. But she loved him, and his parents begged her to stay close. Familiar faces might bring it back. So she stayed, and she watched a nightmare play out in her own life. Devon didn't want her in the house they'd been about to share. He was polite, distant, faintly uncomfortable around her, like his body remembered something his mind refused to. He moved into the guest room. He let her stay only because his mother insisted. And every day Imani cooked for a man who ate her food without knowing she'd made it for him 100 times before, and checked his medications, and pretended her heart wasn't being slowly removed with a dull knife. Brielle was at the house constantly. She'd reinvented herself overnight as the devoted friend, the one who'd always been there, and Devin, with no memory to contradict her, believed it. She angled to move in to help. His parents shut that down flat, which was the one mercy in all of it, but she kept coming. She got him to buy her things. A necklace for her birthday, a dinner at the most expensive place in the city, candles and the whole performance. Imani watched it happen and said nothing, because what was there to say? That woman drained our savings and slashed my clothes and lied to your sister, and you don't remember any of it? She had no proof of half of it. She had only her own broken heart, and that wasn't evidence of anything. It was at that birthday dinner that Brielle made her move. Imani pieced it together afterward, from a waiter and a half-finished bottle, and Devin's own horrified account. Brielle had slipped something into his wine. He'd gone dizzy, foggy, and she'd suggested they go up to a room in the hotel to let him rest, and he'd been disoriented enough to agree. She got him onto the bed. She took off his shoes. She started on the buttons of his shirt, and she was reaching to kiss him when, behind his swimming eyes, a face. Not Brielle's. A woman in a chef's coat with flour on her cheek, arguing with him about acid in a sauce, laughing at him for being superstitious about a wedding date. A woman who'd slapped him in a nightclub and apologized for nothing. Imani. The pain in his head came like a blade, but the memories came with it and didn't stop. All of it, the porch, the ring, the kitchen, the arm he'd thrown across her chest in the half-second before everything went dark. He shoved Brielle off of him, got to his feet, and walked out of that room without his shoes. He went home. The house was dark. Imani, he called, throwing open doors. Imani. She wasn't there. He found the guest room empty. Her clothes gone, the closet bare, the dresser cleared. On the nightstand, one sheet of paper, 4 words in her handwriting. I'm done holding on. She'd left that night. Finally, after weeks of standing in a house where the man she loved looked through her, she'd packed her bag and gone, because there's only so long a person can grieve someone who's still alive. Devin read the note 3 times before his hands started shaking. He called her. It went to voicemail. He called again. He called her mother, who hadn't heard from her. He called the restaurant, Asha, everyone, and no one knew where she was. What no one knew was that Imani, walking to her car with her suitcase, had felt the world go gray at the edges and folded onto the sidewalk. A couple coming out of a coffee shop had found her and called an ambulance. Her phone rang and rang in a plastic bag of her belongings until a nurse finally answered it. Are you family? The nurse asked the frantic man on the line. Devin ran every red light in Charlotte getting there. He found her small in a hospital bed, the woman who was never small, and he sat down beside her and took her hand and said her name like it was the only word he knew. I remember, he said. I remember everything. I'm so sorry. I'm not losing you again. Somewhere far down, Imani heard him. She'd know that voice in the dark, at the bottom of anything. She opened her eyes. He pulled her into him before she could say a word, careful of the wires in the IV line, and held on like the holding was the only thing keeping them both upright. I remember, he said again, into her hair. All of it. And then the doctor came in with a face that didn't match the room, and told them, gently, like he wasn't sure how it would land, that Imani was just over 4 weeks pregnant. Imani did the math without meaning to. One night, more than a month back before the wedding, when she'd believed with her whole heart that Devin had come all the way back to himself, she'd been so happy. She'd had no idea it was a window that would slam shut hours later. A baby. After all of it. Devin pressed his forehead to hers and didn't try to hide that he was crying, and Imani, who'd spent a lifetime certain she'd never want any of this, put her hand over the small impossible fact of it and started to laugh through her own tears. The truth came out the way truth tends to, all at once after hiding for so long. The investigation into the crash had stalled for weeks. A hit-and-run SUV, no plate, nothing. But the car turned up at a body shop 2 counties over, and the driver leaned on hard enough, gave up the name of the woman who'd paid him. Brielle had hired him. She'd known the route to the boutique, known the fitting was that afternoon, known the curve by the reservoir. She'd meant for Imani to die in that car. She'd meant to be the one left standing at Devin's side when the dust settled. And when the crash didn't kill Imani but stole Imani out of Devin's mind instead, she'd treated it like a gift and pressed her advantage. She confessed the rest under the weight of it, the savings she'd stolen to fund her own debts and her own jealousy, the clothes, the poison she'd dripped into Asha's ear, the drugged wine at the hotel, all of it laid out in a courtroom, in front of Imani, who sat in the gallery with one hand over her belly and made herself watch every minute. There was no version of it where Brielle was misunderstood. The jury didn't take long. The judge gave her 14 years for conspiracy to commit murder, theft, and a list of other charges, and when they let her out, she looked back once at Imani with an expression that had no remorse in it at all, only the old familiar resentment, and Imani understood then that this was simply who Brielle was, and probably always had been, underneath 6 years of brunches and split rent and braided hair. Some people will burn down everything you built together, rather than watch you have one thing they wanted. Imani didn't stop there. On the advice of a lawyer with a quiet, vicious competence she came to love, she sued for the stolen money and won every cent of it back. And she made sure the record showed in plain language exactly what Brielle had done, and exactly who had been telling the truth all along. She did it less for the money than for the principle. Because she'd spent months being the one whose name got whispered about, the cold gold digger in someone else's story, and she wanted it written down somewhere that none of that had ever been real. They married on a beach in the Carolinas in the spring, with the wind off the water, and Asha crying in the front row, and Imani's mother holding her hand too tight and not saying a single word about how long it had taken. Imani wore the ivory dress that had survived a car crash in a garment bag in the trunk. Devon couldn't get through his vows without stopping twice. She didn't laugh at him for it. She thought standing there about the girl she'd been at 25, so sure that love was a trap with her name on it, so determined to stay free of it. She'd built that belief out of real things, her parents' silences, her aunt left behind, her cousin's makeup over a bruise. It hadn't come from nowhere. But she'd built it into a wall, and the wall had kept out the good with the bad. And it had taken a man who'd built the exact same wall for the exact same reasons to show her she could take hers down. The baby came in the fall, a girl with her father's stubborn brow and her mother's hands, fingers long enough that Devon swore she'd cook. Imani held her in the gray dawn light of the hospital and thought about all the ways the year could have ended and hadn't. She'd believed once that the safest life was the one you lived alone, where no one could reach in and break anything. She didn't believe that anymore. The breaking had come anyway. It always finds you, one way or another, and what had saved her wasn't a wall. It was the man who'd thrown his arm across her chest in the half-second before the dark, and remembered her name from the bottom of his own ruined memory, and come running through every red light in the city to sit beside a bed and refuse to let go. She looked down at her daughter and made her a quiet promise that the only walls she'd ever teach her to build were the kind with a door.